This episode of Job Shadowing HE is kindly sponsored by Gayton B. Sanderson, the UK's leadership expert across public services, not-for-profit and education. Partnering with universities to navigate change and build stronger, more inclusive leadership teams, Gayton B. Sanderson has deep expertise in executive search, interim leadership and leadership development. Through executive search and interim leadership services, they identify and place HE leaders who reflect the communities they serve and who can drive success as the higher education landscape evolves. Through leadership development and talent consultancy services, they work closely with you to develop leaders who can deliver lasting impacts in inclusivity, collaboration and performance. Whether you're looking for your next Vice-Chancellor or seeking to recruit and develop your senior leaders, choose the experts who are known for delivering diverse shortlists, long-lasting leadership interventions and world-class client and candidate service. I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Professor Ken Sloan, Vice-Chancellor and CEO of Harper University. Ken has extensive experience in strategy leadership, governance and commercial activities, gained through both the higher education sector, including as Registrar and Chief Operating Officer at the University of Warwick and as a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Australia's Monash University, as well as through senior roles in the private sector. Ken became Vice-Chancellor of Harper in 2021, and in this episode we discuss his leadership of the specialist university, including its strategic focus, living the institutional values, the role of entrepreneurship, and his overall optimism about the future. We also reflect more broadly on the vital role of specialist institutions and why having a diverse UK HE sector can and should be maintained. Ken also talks about why being philanthropic in small ways with our time has the potential to create significant positive impact on others, and he reflects on what motivates him to remain in HE. Ken, welcome to the podcast and thank you for being my guest in this episode. You're Vice-Chancellor and CEO of Harper University. Can you tell us a bit more about the history, current size, shape and focus of the institution?
Hello, Susanna. I'm really happy to be with you. Well, Harper University is an institution that started in 1901 with 6 students with a focus on keeping agriculture relevant for future ages. And then if you fast forward to 2012, it became a university because it was originally established as a college. And then here we are now, we've got just over 5,000 students. Our focus is on food production technology, animal health and well-being and sustainability. So we're a specialist institution, well connected to industry and really focused on securing the future food supply line.
And your arrival at Harper in November 2021 was your first Vice-Chancellor role. And I'm interested to talk a bit more about your earlier career path, which has not been through an academic route and not always within universities. Can you step us through your career path so far?
So I started in the private sector working for KPMG and wasn't really settling into accountancy, and ended up doing some graduate recruitment work for KPMG that took me to the University of Warwick. And I found a job advertised on a board at the University of Warwick, applied for that job, and that was my first point of entry into higher education. I worked in a number of different professional areas and obviously became increasingly more senior. I was very lucky that I got to work in the Vice-Chancellor's office quite early, so I got a helicopter view of what a university looks like. And then in 2010, I left the sector to go and work for the FTSE 100 company Serco and worked with them looking at how to develop new market opportunities. I was part of a global business development team, and that was a really fascinating thing. After that, I returned to Warwick and was at Warwick again for another 4 years. prior to a semester at Tsinghua University in China, where I was at the Schwarzman College for its opening in China, and then moved on to be the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Enterprise and Governance at Monash University, and obviously came to be the Vice-Chancellor of Harper Adams in 2021. So in a nutshell, that's how I got from A to B.
And did you always have an ambition to be a Vice-Chancellor, or was there a moment in your career that, I don't know, motivated or inspired you to progress to that route?
It's an interesting question, because I think there are some people who met me earlier in the career who now say that that was always the case. And I genuinely don't believe it was the case, because I was on more of a professional commercial route. And at that point in time, it was unheard of to have vice chancellors who were appointed from anything other than a straight academic track. I think it really changed when I was in Australia, because as a deputy vice chancellor at Monash, you had a strategic agenda that you led on, which meant that you were inevitably providing leadership to the whole university for that area. So that covered all areas from academic research, education, and professional. And I had a professional mentor over there, and he threw me with a question at a lunch we had once, where he said, well, which institution are you going to leave here to run? And I dismissed it initially. And then he said, well, why wouldn't you want to go and run an institution? You can clearly have this really broad understanding of universities. You know what excellence looks like in institutions. So why wouldn't you do that? So that was really the point at which I started to think about it. Had a conversation with the vice chancellor I was reporting to, and she reinforced that point and encouraged me to think of opportunities from that point on. So it was quite a late decision, but I was really grateful for the steer and the point that people had made.
Picking up on the career journey you shared, you have notable experience of going between the HE and private sectors. You've also moved between countries and therefore experienced different HE environments. And you've been appointed into a VC position from what's primarily been a professional and commercial background. In 2023, you wrote a chapter for the International Perspectives Journal entitled A View from Outside: Perspectives on the Purpose and Value of Appointing External Leaders in Higher Education and How to Retain Them. And I was wondering, to what extent was that chapter informed by your own experiences? And what are your thoughts about how we could do better in supporting more diverse routes into leadership appointments?
There was an element of personal experience, because I'd had the experience of going to work in a Chinese university, but more substantively in an Australian university. And even though between Australia and the UK we share a language, they are fundamentally different countries with different foundations and different value sets. And so you can't just assume that you're going to arrive and know how to work in that setting. Equally, institutions and organizations can't just assume you know how to operate as well. And in preparing to write that chapter, I spoke to about 30 people, and they were people who had either gone to another country, they'd got a leadership position in higher education from outside the sector, or they'd got a leadership position from a direction that most people were not expecting them to come from, which is more akin to my experience. And what it really showed was, where those universities had generally thought about engaging that broader expertise, they actually thought about it properly. They thought about how to induct people. They actually explained to their internal communities why they made that appointment and why that person came from that particular background and what they could offer. Where it was less successful was where institutions were giving an impression that they wanted an open perspective, but actually what they wanted when the person got there was to assimilate very quickly and center around the norms. So I think that it's a high risk thing for both the person and the institution if the institution hasn't thought through the reason why it's bringing an external perspective in. And so I think that it is good. We're facing such different challenges in the sector to what we would have faced 20 years ago. So having a broad range of expertise in a leadership team is really important. But we have to have patience and understanding and empathy to enable those different perspectives to land in our institutions and to help people to succeed.
In your conclusion to that chapter, you also highlight the value of encouraging both academic and professional staff to look outward and to gain experiences in other sectors and settings as part of their professional development. What would you say was the most significant aspect of your own experience in the other settings that you've experienced that informs the leader you are today?
I think there were two examples, one from within the sector and one from outside. So I spent some time at Warwick at a thing called the National Academy for Gifted and Talented Youth, which was reporting directly to the Department for Education. And it really exposed me to how a government department looked back at a university and looked back at the education system. And it really brought home to me that unless we put the effort in, it's very difficult to get alignment between those perspectives. So that was helpful. It made me realize that I can't take it for granted that what I do is understood by people. And then when I went to Serco, they had three very different ways of looking at the staff within the organization. They had people who were very operational, focused on what was happening today. They had what we call development people who would take what they were doing today and develop to new opportunities. And then they had people who were what I would call more like market makers. They were thinking well ahead of the organization's current performance to try and plan opportunities and spaces for the organization to go in. What that really showed me was that you have to be quite deliberate about that. So I think there is a sense that growth and development and opportunities are just sort of happen chance. They just happen to appear. And there is an element of that. Of course there is. We have good luck, fortune, we bump into people and we do interesting things. But I thought it was really interesting how they'd explicitly looked at the type of staff that they had and had really spoken quite explicitly in their objective setting over what their role was in the organization and how they were there to secure its future. And that's something that I took into the growth and development work within Monash. And it's also, we have a growth team within Harper Adams, and we've taken that model as well. So really, really helpful to see an organization wanted to achieve positive outcomes, but coming at it from a very different perspective to what I was used to.
As Vice-Chancellor, you're leading the institution through a time when there's much instability in the country and in the world. Yet I've read your leadership approach is very much grounded in optimism. What does the Harper Adams Vision 2030 look like? And how do you ensure that optimism that you have doesn't drift over into optimism bias?
So there's something about smaller institutions anyway, which is that they don't actually have a huge amount of spare capacity. They don't have spare resources. So anything they do has to be really realistic and pragmatic. But if you think about what we're connected to, go back to the founding purpose of the institution, what we know is we're looking out to a global population of 10 billion people, and we don't have a food system across our country, across our planet, which is going to be able to deliver good, high quality food to that population in a way which doesn't have some negative effect on the planet itself. So, but you have to start with optimism and say that that's a problem to be solved as opposed to something to be defeated by. And in order to play an active role in that, Harper Adams needed to move from just being something which was focused on the rural sector and the national food system and animal well-being system and sustainability to something that was more globally connected. It's also the case, though, we can't take it for granted in a volatile time that the conditions are right for smaller and specialist universities to survive in those times. So it was also really important that we built influence into that so that we really amplified what the distinctive role that specialist institutions bring to choice for students, but also for the shape and texture of the higher education sector. And to some extent, the strategy is, it's an overused phrase, but it's a North Star to help mobilize us towards a different place. And as a Vice-Chancellor, in the end, all I am is a steward of this institution, and my job is to shift its trajectory if I can achieve that. But we also, when we wrote that strategy, we didn't know that there was going to be a war in Ukraine. We didn't know that there was going to be a war in the Middle East. We didn't know that there were going to be such a rapid acceleration of climate effects. So it is optimistic, but it also has to be flexible and adaptable. And that's how we've designed it. So it isn't linear. It isn't there to hit a series of absolute defined outcomes. But what it is to create a connected, industrially connected, relevant institution that has been seen to make a tangible difference to the specialist industries it supports. And that's what we're working on. And so far, that's going well.
And if I was to ask your colleagues to describe you and your leadership of the institution and of that Vision 2030, what authentic aspects would you hope they'd draw out?
I think they would say that I've challenged the institution to think openly and potentially differently about itself. And I'm sure that will have made some people uncomfortable, and I'm sure that will have made some people feel liberated because they could start to think in a different way. But I think they would probably talk about a number of things. I think they would say I'm optimistic. I think they would say that I listen and take the time to listen, even though we're all time poor. It's important to make sure that we do that. I am deliberately trying to be empathetic in the sense, though, I actually want to understand the context that people in the institution are in, whether that's students or staff, as we're trying to build ourselves forward. But I also think that they would say that I'm pretty resolute and determined as well. So I'm not as fixated on the precise path we take. I am more fixated on the fact that I think it's important that we get there. And the easiest and best way to get there is to take people with you. And therefore, you've got to invest time in engagement and listening to their thoughts and ideas and making sure that they are playing an active role in what happens, not just simply being passively carried on. And that's something that we're working very hard at the institution.
I want to pick up a bit more about the culture of the university and the 4 underpinning values: curious heads, practical hands, courageous hearts, and growing together. And looking at those words on paper, I mean, they seem to offer a spirit of real collaborative community. How were those values developed, and what do they look like day to day within the university environment?
So we had a fairly broad consultation when we were putting the strategy together. One of the things that we were asking was to tell us about the true, authentic character of the institution, but also how do we get things done? We also were asking people what they valued about the institution, what they were most worried about changing. And what fell out of it were these 4 things, which were we're a very practical oriented institution. So even though that we deal with intellectual subjects and research, and we're always seeing it in the context of how it makes a practical application in the real world, in industry and society in general. We are an institution which is a problem-solving institution, and that takes curiosity. We're also an evidence-based institution, so we want it underpinned by knowledge and insight and evidence. Agriculture, the veterinary profession, the whole sustainability professions, everything all around them, have had to go through such tumultuous changes. If you think back over the last 10 years, you've had Brexit and you've had a pandemic, and now you've got a disruption of global supply chains, and as well as all the climatic impacts. And yet we've needed to preserve our food supplies, and we've also needed to keep animals safe and well during that particular period. That takes courage, that takes tenacity. But the one thing I think is the standout that people say about Harper is this sense of connectivity amongst the people. And I'm often challenged by people in larger institutions say, well, that's obviously something you can do in a place like Harper, that's harder to do elsewhere. I don't agree with that at all. In fact, it takes me back to my Serco days, that even though the company had 100,000 people, you were still attached to a family of no more than about 500 to 600, because that was the maximum they felt that you could get to know. So I think that sense of community we built at Harper can be replicated elsewhere. It just needs a different thinking process to get there. But that's where the values came from.
And picking up on that difference between the small and large institutions, I mean, you've been a leader in both small and large institutions, looking back at your career path and where you are now. To what extent would you say that the size of the institution makes a difference to institutional values being lived, or are there other factors involved?
I think size of institution, it can be a relevant factor, because the one thing that's very clear is that I can see in a very connected way what's happening in the institution. I can see all aspects of the institution on a fairly regular basis. So as well as doing the town hall staff meetings that we do, drop-in sessions, I do sessions with students, I actually do some teaching on some of the classes. So I get to see different parts of the institution. But I think it all comes down to intention. And the way in which that's built in a larger institution would have to be different. But it does come down to intention. And I think that's the most significant thing, that if you intentionally want to connect an organization together, you've got to have nodes of intention that help you to do that. And in a smaller institution, that's more likely to come directly from the top. In a larger institution, you might need to rely on other parts of the institution to take that role for you. But I don't think that a smaller institution is the reason why it is the case. The thing that I found very interesting about Harper when I came was that it was a well-connected community of people, but it was highly siloed in the way in which it operated. And I thought for a smaller institution that wouldn't be the case, but it turns out it was the case, because even within that broad identity, people wanted to have their own identity. So we've done a lot of work on how to really think and develop as a whole institution and worry less about the internal organizational parts of it.
Beyond your leadership of the university, you're also chair of BUFDG, the sector membership organisations for nearly 70 diverse institutions that champion vocational and technical education, professional programmes and specialist providers. And you've talked already about, specialist providers. You are one. You're a passionate champion for the preservation of institutional diversity within the HE sector. Now, that idea of institutional diversity is something that I'm sure many people would likely agree with in principle. But I'm wondering how that idea in principle can be translated into a more, broadly shared passion and reality, particularly in the constrained financial environment that we're operating in.
Really good and challenging question, Susanna, and something that at BUFDG we grapple with, and is what we do in terms of the advocacy and relationships we build with government agencies and other things. I think there's an interesting point of comparison. If you were to go back and look at the Australian system about 30 years ago, it had a much more diverse set of institutions than it does now. And the vast majority of specialist institutions have been brought into larger entities, and their distinctive identities are no longer as strong as they were before. And Professor Glyn Davis, who is currently the acting Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne and previously was the substantive Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne some years ago, he wrote a book chapter on this and talked about what happens to the shape of the system when you just allow economic forces and political forces to drive it in that sense. And I think that the shape of the higher education system, which has adapted, we now have private operators, specialist operators, we have institutions that have been here for 700-800 years and institutions that have been here for less than 10 years. They have to have a connection and relevance to the society in which they're in. But in the model that we have, at the heart of it is student choice and also connections to society and industry. And we know that as a specialist institution, we are really focused on the specialist industries that we work with, but we're also a choice for a particular set of students. If you have a look at the students who are choosing Harper, they're not comparing us in the main to large institutions. They're making an active choice to go to a particular type of institution. So I think it's really important that as regulation develops and policy develops and funding policies develop, that we do look at the shape and distinctiveness of our sector and also the range of choices we're genuinely offering people. I remember on my very first day that I was taken around the campus by different sets of students. And I was coming from Monash, which had over 90,000 students, and like 8 or 9 campuses in 5 countries. And I was coming to an institution which was a single campus and, just over 5,000 students. And the very first student spoke to me and I said, what was your first impression when you got here? And she said, I couldn't believe how big it is. And so we have to assume that people are coming from different contexts and different places. Of course, we need to find ways to make them more sustainable. And of course, we've got to make sure that regulation delivers what it should do, which is to ensure that we've got quality. But I don't think it's an impossible ask even in these financially constrained times to create a model and support a model through collaboration and through partnerships to enable institutions to have a distinctive identity and to go from the largest institutions, the broadest comprehensive institutions, to those that like the Central School of Ballet, which has got 150 students and is clearly the best possible place for those students to go to. I think that's a problem to be solved. And given that universities are full of the brightest minds, including the best economists, the best systems designers, etc., I'm sure we can apply that thinking to ourselves to make sure that we don't have to compromise on specialism and distinctiveness.
And picking up a bit more about that point about preserving that institutional diversity that you've talked about, I mean, presumably that's about preserving the reality of diversity, not necessarily about institutions continuing to operate just as they are or always have done.
That's entirely true. It means you have to challenge yourself into thinking about the way in which you operate. So if you think about what happened 6-7 years ago, Keele University and Harper Adams University decided to come together to build a joint vet school. It was the first joint vet school to be built. And we've had our successful graduates go out. We got the highest rating in the NSS for students going out last year. That was 2 institutions identifying their collective strengths. They have stayed structurally separate, but they brought their collaborative power together and so they still have their distinctiveness, but they also have found a way to be future-proofed and think future-focused. We're working on a really interesting idea about a multi-university model at the moment, which I'll say more about in the not too distant future, which again is around preserving institutional identity and institutional form, but maximizing the benefits of collaboration that people can have. So it isn't about freezing in time. It isn't about diversity on a particular day. And also there's diversity of provision, but then we also have to tackle the issues of diversity of access to that provision. So Harper Adams has been based on a rural setting for over 120 years. But 2 years ago, we opened a new base in central urban Telford because we were no longer going to just sit and watch what was happening in Telford. We wanted to make sure that we were reaching out to the community, out to business. That's fundamentally changed how people see the institution, but we're still true to the defining principles of the institution. So it's an agile developmental issue, but I still think the notion of being able to identify particular institutions and their strengths. In our case, it's a subject mix strength. In other cases, it could be a teaching focus. In other cases, it could be a research focus. But I think it's possible to have a broadly shaped system and still make it work within the economics that we've got.
Building on the theme that you've just talked about there about doing things differently, entrepreneurship is a theme that cuts through your own career, and entrepreneurial leadership is something that you've written about most recently in a HEPI publication with the National Centre for Entrepreneurship in Education. What does entrepreneurial leadership mean to you, and how do you think that concept needs to be embedded into the short and medium term future of the sector?
For me, entrepreneurial leadership is thinking about ultimately what entrepreneurial activity is, which is creating value out of things that you have got and being able to flex and adapt how you see the things that you've got in order to either increase or augment the value of what you're creating. So in some cases, that could be very clearly having like business development functions or enterprise areas where you can support startups and spin outs. But more fundamentally, entrepreneurial leadership is about problem solving and about finding a way to get to a better outcome from the situation that you're currently in. I remember when I first started at Warwick, I was exposed to a thing which is called the Earned Income Group. And the thing that really had an effect on me was the fact that Earned Income Group wasn't just a set of commercial professionals out there trying to develop new things. It was full of academics, and what they were being encouraged to do was to challenge the shape and size of their departments, to think about the product mix that they had, to think about the areas of research they were exploring, the partnerships they had, in order to extend the reach and impact that the institution has got. So I think that if an institution isn't nurturing entrepreneurial leadership, there is a risk that actually it will create a sense of stasis and being frozen in time. And at a time when we know that resources are getting tighter, not just within the sector, but outside of the sector as well, I think it's going to take even more entrepreneurial leadership to enable that to be the case. But ultimately, it's purposeful value creation, true to the principles of the institutions that we're in, but not just sitting on our laurels and hoping that someone will sort it for us.
And in the Harper Adams Vision 2030 that we talked about earlier, I mean, there's a plan to embed an entrepreneurial culture into the curriculum of all the courses that you have there. And that's possibly a step further than the sort of professionally ready phrase we see featured in courses in many other parts of the sector. What's the vision behind that ambition, and how's the work going?
So for a number of courses, they start with an enterprise-focused module where they have a kickoff module and they look at the subject in the context of business and society. And in some cases, they are given like a mini enterprise challenge to work on. So we're getting them to think about the subject in the context of the real economy. In other areas, what we're doing is we're infusing who they're taught by bringing in business leaders and innovators and entrepreneurs so that they can actually see how that subject has been translated into different types of organization. So employers and employees, startups, mid-size, large scale. And at the same time, what we're doing is having programs where we're encouraging people, both staff and students, to think about how to operate their businesses. What I was really surprised at when I came to Harper was the number of people who work at Harper who already have a business of some sort. They had it before they came to the university. They've continued to do that. And I remember recently we were having a visit from the Food Security Minister, Angela Eagle. And one of the questions that we were asking the students was, how many of you intend to be employers compared to employees? And it was really marked in the course that we were talking to, which wasn't a business course, that over half of the students were saying they intended to be an employer, not an employee. So if we're saying that the growth in the economy is going to be the most significant challenge if we're going to afford all of the other social contributions that we make as a society, we do need more people to think about how to become value creators and value makers, not just contributors to organizations. And that's something that we're thinking very hard on at the moment.
Back to talking about you as a leader and as a professional, voluntary service has been an integral part of your career experience. I mean, we mentioned earlier about your role as chair of Guild HE, but your voluntary work within and beyond the sector reaches much further than that. How would you say the voluntary work you've done contributes to the person and or leader you are today?
It's always an interesting thing for me thinking about volunteering, because there's a risk when you talk about it, you can sound like you're coming across as someone who's just a do-gooder. I think I've always benefited from people at different stages of my life who have shown generosity to me in some way. A librarian when I was 11 who challenged me on the GCSE results I was going to get and what prize I'd be given if I got a certain set of grades. At that moment in time, it was a massive boost for me. She didn't have to do that. She just focused on that. But if I give a couple of examples that it might help. One of the most important things was when I was chair of governors of a school in Coventry, because here I was working in a university, but the school was going to be the way in which we actually connected with the potential applicant pool. And yet this was a school in highly challenging circumstances, in highly deprived communities. So that time gave me more insight into the challenges that people feel and felt. And actually, some of those challenges were challenges I'd had when I was younger as well. So it was interesting to connect to that. If I think more recently, a young man from Uganda reached out to me about 6 years ago and said he was trying to get a voluntary organisation up across 3 villages targeted on abandoned or orphaned children, getting them into education so that they could use the land as a natural resource. That really grounded me in understanding just how much we have in the UK compared to so many different areas, and also just how optimistic some people are, despite the fact that they have limited resources. So, this young man, David Adengu, and now he's gone on and he's run this thing called Teapi for Peace in Uganda. We've got like 25 young people going through school. It's really made sure that I don't get away from the fact that my lived reality is not the same as everybody else's lived reality. And then the final one, and which is one I really enjoy at the moment, is I'm chair of the Ironbridge Gorge UNESCO World Heritage Site locally. So the steering group that works with that. And just being connected to something that was grounded in an age, so firstly, the natural gorge has developed over millennia, and then it's got an iconic memory because it was the foundation stone for the Industrial Revolution, that use of resources to build that powerful bridge and everything that followed from it. And yet here we are now, a set of volunteers, and what we're trying to do is to make sure that environment, that ecosystem, that place is handed on well to future generations. And it really has helped to make sure that I don't take things for granted.
And on your LinkedIn profile, you say that we all have the potential to be philanthropic in small ways with our time, and that the significant impact can be delivered through small contributions. To what extent would you like to see more of that philanthropy within or towards higher education?
There's a couple of things. One, I think I'd like to see more recognition of the philanthropy that already exists. So, and I don't just mean financial philanthropy, I mean time philanthropy. So if I think at Harper Adams, we've got a community fridge on our campus, and we have a band of volunteers that go out every day to local supermarkets, claim all the excess food, bring it to the university, sort it. And I know that there are members of staff who rely on that community fridge. I know that some students rely on that community fridge. So it's important that those acts of generosity are seen and they're heard and they're acknowledged. We've also had examples in the past where the government has had a match funding scheme on philanthropy to encourage people to give to universities and to support the work of universities. And I do think that would be something that the government would be worth looking at again, to see if they could get more third sector contributions in. But the most valuable thing that we have is time. And yet the thing that we often find is the most challenging is time. And I think we do need to try and create opportunities for staff and for students to have the time to do something which genuinely has a positive impact, not only for themselves, but on other people. And there is a risk that as we move to something which is much more of a consumeristic approach to thinking about higher education, and a ever more busy time within higher education, that those acts of charity, of time, can be lost. And I think we would be a lesser sector if we didn't provide access to those things. And they have an amazing effect. I put a thing on LinkedIn the other day, rather silly thing, but I was standing in Starbucks in Euston 2 weeks ago, and as I was just about to pay, a person tapped the thing and said, "I don't know when your birthday is, but happy birthday when it comes." I mean, I was buzzing all day for that particular thing. So at a time when it feels like the world is getting more isolated, where conflict is much more visible to people of all generations, and where people's sense of fears for the future are actually, in some cases, dominating their perspective on the future, the more we can do to encourage people to just show the powerful positivity that humans can bring to each other. And it doesn't have to be a big grand gesture. It can be a tiny little thing. It can be a thank you. It can be anything at all. But the more we do to encourage that, I think we can hold on to the nature that the dominant narrative on the news might be about negative human nature. But in reality, we're surrounded by people who have a huge amount to give. And we should be very positive and optimistic about that.
And finishing up our conversation today, what is it that motivates you to carry on working in higher education?
I often used to say on induction days at a previous institution that you might have a bad day, but your university isn't having a bad day. And the reason it isn't is because there is something being discovered at that institution. There's something new being taught. There's an imagination that's being opened. There's a creative piece that's being crafted. There's a emerging community of younger people being brought forward who may not know how to get into higher education. You know, I was the other day at our Telford branch, and the national organisation Future Leaders UK, their Telford cohort had started, and the energy of those young people of every diversity of community from Telford who have been energized to think passionately about their future. And it's the convening space of universities which create those opportunities. And that is what makes me passionate. And I think the other thing is, this is the two things that my own identity means there have been times where I have not always felt a sense of belonging, and yet I'm in a sector where I do feel a real sense of belonging. And having come up against cancer about a decade ago and survived it, being in an institutional setting and in a sector which is constantly looking at solving some of the most insurmountable problems, what more is there to do than want to come to work in a place like that every day?
Ken, it's been really great talking to you today. Thank you so much for being my guest.
No, thanks for having me, Susanna.
The Association of Higher Education Professionals and the British University's Finance Directors Group, BUFDG, are both proud to support Job Shadowing HE as a valuable source of professional insight. The podcast was presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.